I define collaboration maybe more broadly than others do. Some speak about collaboration and they speak about working in an interdisciplinary way with artists from other disciplines, which would be a dancer, a choreographer, a video artist, X, Y, Z. And that's absolutely true, and I have certainly had many of those experiences myself, which I find wonderful, rewarding, challenging, interesting, frustrating, ultimately, with all of that, a place you want to go back to. But for me, my collaborations are even more broadly defined because I really like to write works that are commissioned by people who are my friends, my associates, people I've had professional contacts with who are virtuosi in one way or another. And so making pieces that are, if you want, tailor-made for some of the features of those individual musicians and ensembles and so forth is really terrific because in a way one takes one's own interests, bounces them off of the group, takes the group's expertise and factors that in, and it's a kind of mutual pushing and pulling which results in some works that have, I think, a very unique perspective because they're handmade. If you're writing a piece for a generic orchestra, for example, and you know that you might have X amount of rehearsal time, yes, it's true, you could, if you're writing for the Chicago Symphony, tailor your work to the fact that they have an unbelievable brass section. So you might wish to exploit that brass and wind section, which they're known for. But nevertheless, it's still a bit more of a generic thing than if you're writing a piece for a specific player who plays a certain way, who has a certain history, and you're collaborating with that player to create something which perhaps in some ways extends the repertoire. And then the player promotes the work, extends the work, teaches his students or her students the work. And the idea is that one is creating a sense of new repertoire, which we hope feeds the kind of tradition that we come from, so that the art form stays alive. That's one kind of collaboration. Another kind of collaboration is, for example, I've worked a lot with the poetry of some individual poets whom I like, but who are dead. You can imagine that this feels very collaborative, right? Because you're trying to understand as much as you can about what it was they were after, how they worked, their larger body of work. And so I feel very much, not like I would have their approval or anything like that, but I have the feeling oftentimes that it's a collaboration. It's just that one partner is a silent partner who is providing the basic material and the context of a whole body of work that one can then try to enlighten in a certain way. Then there are collaborations where you work with live poets, where, for example, one can imagine lots of different possibilities where the poet and the musician go back and forth in some way, or there is a poem and the musician does certain things with it. And this will lead me to my next comment about electronics. One of the things I'm working with now is finding a poet and a poem that I like very much, and then having that poem read, ideally by the poet. And not just a single reading, but multiple readings, because they would never read the poem the same way twice. It's like a music performer. There are going to be subtle nuances or sometimes not so subtle nuances. And so weaving a pathway through multiple readings and then using the text as raw sonic materials that can be analyzed, processed, remodeled, using technology as a way to kind of create a sound environment made out of the words themselves. And then the notion that you may take the speech itself and try to find a way to sort of vault it up into that highly stylized reading, which is, we call singing, right? So singing is a kind of heightened speaking, and in this heightened speaking, there has to be a reason for the way that you set the text in a certain sense. And so this to me gives you a couple of different levels on which you might work with a poem, for example, and I'm really interested in that at the moment. Coming back to the electronics, the way that I've approached electronics is very different because I'm not an expert. There are people who are computer music composers, and that's what they do, and they're very often very inventive in creating patches and software and so forth. And that's a big focus of their work, which is to create tools which enable you to do certain kinds of things. I'm not very interested in creating the tool because, for example, a violin, well, I didn't have to invent a violin, right? So I can use it and there's a praxis and so forth. I can try to extend it in some ways, but it already exists. So the way that I've worked with electronics is I think of electronics as a kind of an extension of what's already there. So I always work with acoustic sounds or models, and this would be regarded by some in the electronic field as sort of silly or my view is that this takes one particular tradition, which is called the musique concrète tradition, and it extends it in a certain way. And I'm really interested, for example, let's say one of the models that I've been working with lately is that I'm interested in sound space and resonance. And so the voice, well, I like to imagine myself as a very small person sitting at the front of a mouth, right? So if you were to do that, and this is the hall, right, inside your mouth, you would hear sounds coming from all kinds of different places, because when we make sounds, we know that they're made in different places in the vocal cavity and so forth. So I begin with that as a way to create a sound space that articulates, like, let's say, the poems. So the S, which might be made sort of at the front, that might begin always in the front of the hall, because that's where it is in the mouth. But then maybe that would granulate and spread out all around you, and then maybe it would circulate like this, because that is some characteristic that I wish to elaborate upon. So that's the kind of, I would say, modeling that I'm interested in. I'm also interested in taking different kinds of acoustic sounds and working in the place that puts them together. So for example, if you take, let's say, the sound of a bell, and you take a vowel, and you find a way to create a space where the sound of the bell and the vowel can meet somewhere in the middle, so you have the sort of attack characteristics of a bell sound and its complexity, and then it morphs one way or another into a vowel, and then the vowel disintegrates into other kinds of things. That's a space that I'm interested in working with, because it feels very much like the sounds take on a kind of a virtual environmental elaboration of what's already there, naturally speaking. So that's probably the best way I can describe my interest in the electronics at this point.
That's amazing. That's really interesting.
Mm-hmm. Well, sometimes it's interesting, and sometimes you have an idea, and I work. Fortunately, because of the situation I'm in, I can retain outside experts as consultants to design the software that will make these experiments. Sometimes you can work for 2 weeks. I tell you right now, I'm working with a guy, and there's one image that I love in a poem, and I'm trying to make snow, musical snow, an environment of snow. So, I mean, I live in Buffalo, right? So you're thinking about snow, and we all watch snow, and we all hear it, and it's great to be able to track individual snowflakes coming down and then watch the larger swirls and all of that. And it's all understandable. And we spent a week with him trying to design a patch, and it's nowhere near anything that is like the experience of. It's something, but it's not anything near. So that investment is not going to go anywhere, basically. It's like venture capital that it's a nice idea, but didn't work. So.